All right, folks, this evening we are going to be talking about Matthew 10, but before we do, I want to kind of catch us up to speed. I mean, if we're thinking about what we know so far, having looked at the Gospel of Matthew, and even before, if we start back in, Isaiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, and then, leading up to Malachi, which is right before Matthew, we have all those discussions of the covenants and the promises that God made to Israel. And one of the points that we made was that just like the Abrahamic covenant was unconditional and that God promised to do it and he fulfilled it, in the same way, the Davidic covenant, which involves a land, it's a place, a king, a kingdom, a throne, and they're all eternal, right? And they're all related to David and his lineage. All of those promises were unconditional as well. So, for those folks who say that the church replaced Israel, I've got an issue with that up front because God keeps his promises. For me, I'm not going to argue with that. If God made a promise, I'm going to trust that he's going to keep it. And in the case of the Davidic covenant, it's about Israel. So now we get to be a piece of that as Gentiles or as the church or whatever, but we're not Israel. I'm not Israel. So, you come to Matthew, and the very first thing that Matthew introduces Jesus is in his description of Jesus is that he's actually the son of David. First thing, before he even says son of Abraham, he says son of David. And he's talking about David the king, even in the genealogy, he's focusing on Jesus in the Davidic lineage. So what we saw from there is that once the message starts to come out, Matthew, in talking about Jesus as the Messiah, starts referring back to these Old Testament prophecies about Jesus coming as the Messiah and setting up his kingdom. So to try to make those about a spiritual kingdom when all of those promises in the Old Testament clearly refer to a physical earthly kingdom that Jesus will set up and reign on the throne of, that would be a no. And that's what we see continuing on, that, John the Baptist, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. In other words, Messiah is here. He's offering the kingdom, and Jesus said he's the Elijah who was to come. That's a fulfillment of Malachi 4. So you have all these Old Testament prophecies and ideas that are all wrapped up in the Messiah is coming. He's coming to offer his kingdom. And if his kingdom is accepted, he's going to be wiping out his enemies, setting up his throne, and reigning. That's what we've seen all the way through. And then we see hints of it. We see the ideas around it, pointing to an earthly kingdom, both in the Beatitudes. Remember, he says they'll inherit the earth, right? When does that happen? In the millennium. They will see God. Where's that come from? Isaiah, where he says, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight, and make a highway for our God, and all flesh will see the glory of God. Well, when is that? What we call the millennium. All right. So that's John the Baptist message, and he's preaching that. And we see Jesus saying the same thing. Kingdom of heaven is near. Kingdom of heaven is at hand. In other words, I'm here to offer it, right? So last week we talked about the tail end of the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus concluding it saying, my words are what you want to hear. My words are truth, right? And of course, another way to say it is, I'm the Messiah that's been promised. And I've been telling it to you through everything that I've been sharing with you about what the kingdom's going to look like. What will it be like when I set it up if you accept it? And of course, we know they didn't. But, moving forward, you want to keep that in mind as we move to Matthew 10. So we finished Matthew 7 up. Matthew 8 and 9 are basically Jesus having exchanges with people, teaching on various subjects, and also doing miracles, demonstrating that he had the authority of the Messiah by the miracles that he did. So you have that in chapters 8 and 9. that leads us to chapter 10. And chapter 10 is its own animal. And if I just show you the text, and we'll do that here. In fact, let me see if I can pull that up fairly easily. No, I cannot, because that's not what I want you to see yet. And I apologize. I thought I had my text ready, but if you go to Matthew 10 and you start reading through Matthew 10, what you're going to find is there are several passages in there that if you've been a churchgoer, you've been going to church your whole life, you have heard pieces of Matthew 10 taught or preached and immediately applied to the church with no recognition of how they fit into the broader context of Matthew or why Jesus said them in Matthew 10. Because one of the things that I keep arguing with you guys is almost every piece of Matthew is where it is for a reason. For a reason. Matthew 5 through 7 is there because it's after Matthew 1 through 4. And I mean, as crazy as that sounds, in terms of what Matthew is doing, talking about Jesus and the evidence of his being the Messiah, both by what he said and by what he did, and the reliance on the Old Testament promises, both by the prophets and by within the Davidic covenant. All of those things are they're in an order that it's like there's a reason why that chapter is right there. And what we're going to see moving forward is Matthew 10 is there because it's before Matthew 11 and 12. And I know that's going to sound funny too, but stay with me because all of those pieces, it's like dominoes. They really do fit together very, very neatly in the Gospel of Matthew in a way that they do not anywhere else, apart from maybe the book of Revelation. That'd be about the only thing I can compare it to. So, Jesus having spoken all those truths and then demonstrated his authority as Messiah through all the things that he did, leads him to Matthew 10. And again, Matthew 10 is going to have several passages that we might not even have. You probably have to read them in the notes in terms of the discussion of those problem passages. And please do that because I think you'll find it helpful. But what I would like to do is walk you through Matthew 10 and how it fits. And then I want to kind of pull back and look at the forest of Matthew and compare Matthew 10 to another piece of Matthew and show you how it's connected, because nobody does that. But I think when you see it, you go, of course, it fits right in with what Matthew's doing. If you know that Matthew's goal is to present Jesus as the Messiah who came to offer his kingdom, which he would rule here on earth from the throne of David in Jerusalem, if you understand that that's what Matthew's trying to do, then each of these little pieces starts to make more sense. Okay? That being said, let's take a look at Matthew, because Matthew 10, part of the problem is people don't stop to look at, okay, is Jesus addressing a particular group for a particular reason? And that's the first thing that we're going to see he does here. So let me bring that up on the screen. So, and of course my heading is don't go to the Gentiles. But look, in order to understand how the chapter fits into Matthew's gospel, he gives us a clarification both before and after the chapter. And, John does that in Revelation in terms of bookends. There are several places where there are bookends. Acts 2, Peter's sermon about the church age is, bracketed with bookends, the beginning and the ending of the age, so to speak. So very interesting that Scripture does that in a number of places, and it does it here in Matthew 10 as well. And it's going to help us not only determine the audience, but why he's speaking to his audience, that particular audience. Take a look. The first bullet there that you see in the notes. When he had called his 12 disciples to him, he gave them, the 12 disciples, power over unclean spirits, cast them out, to heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease. Now, the names of the 12 apostles are these, and then he gives all the names, right? And so after all the names, in verse 5, he jumps down and says, these 12. These 12 Jesus sent out and commanded them, who are they? The 12, saying, all right? So, you say, okay, could it be any clearer that he's got 12 people in mind, not anybody else? He got 12 people in mind, all right? So then you say, okay, then he's going to start giving his commands, because that's what verse 5 says. You start going down through the commands, and you say, well, okay, when does he stop talking to them? Because that's the other important piece. If I give a monologue or a sermon, there's a beginning and an end to it, and it's all part of that sermon, and that sermon is a unit. It's a one piece, right? It's a single thing. And what you're going to find is, if you go through Matthew 10, you won't find it because it's actually in Matthew 11:1. So you jump down to Matthew 11:1, which is there at the bottom of the screen. I'll pull it up a little bit. And it says, now it came to pass when Jesus finished commanding his 12 disciples that he departed from there to teach and to preach in their cities. So, if we simply read enough of what Matthew has to say, there really isn't any way to confuse it. Chapter 10 is about what Jesus wants his 12 disciples to accomplish on their mission, right? And any interpretation of any part of this chapter should take that into account, that he both started and ended with the fact that I'm talking to those 12. I'm talking to these 12 people. It's a single unit, right? So, all right, I'm going to stop the share here for just a second. And there we go. Stop the share for a second and just talk through a little bit more about this. Once you determine the audience, you say, well, why is this happening and why is it in chapter 12? So let me go back to answer that question. If you think about what's going on between Matthew 3 and Matthew 9, you have John the Baptist start, you have the introduction of Jesus' ministry, and then you have Jesus calling his disciples, and then you have them doing things together with Jesus speaking and acting, right? And doing miracles and healing and all of that up until chapter 10. Here's what I would suggest. His disciples are called disciples. And another word for disciple is student. If we think about that in contemporary terms, think about yourself. Think about high school for a moment. You went through high school as a student, right? And so you learned from your teachers, you went to class, you had expectations, homework, you went through all that, hard, difficult time. You learned subjects you didn't really particularly care about sometimes. You had to do homework that you didn't really like at points, but you did it because you were aiming at the goal. And of course, the goal was to get to graduation. And then, of course, when you graduate, you go from there. You go out from there and you don't necessarily come back. You're done with that, being a student there. Okay? So what I would tell you is, if you take a very careful look at the very beginning of this commission, what we're going to call a commission. Let me jump back to it. Sorry, I went down too fast. What you see in the beginning is he says he called his 12 disciples to him and he gave them power and all that. And then he gives the names, right? Let's see, hold on. Verse 2, right after he gives them that authority, he says the name of the 12 apostles are these. And hopefully what you noticed is he switched from disciples to apostles. Now he's going to go back and he's still going to talk about them as his 12 and his disciples. But that's just like I would say somebody who was a student of mine and graduated, I'd still say, well, that's one of my students. They're an ex-student, but I'd still refer to them as one of my students, right? Yeah, I would. So at the same time, for the shift to occur between disciple and apostle, what's the difference? Because disciple, the focus is on being a student. I'm observing, I'm learning, I'm watching Jesus as a disciple. But then for Jesus, or for Matthew to record that Jesus went from calling them a disciple to an apostle. What's an apostle? One who is sent out. It's one who's sent out. Go back to our illustration. What are we talking about? Somebody, for one of us, we not only go through high school, we get to 12th grade and we're, in that last semester and we're going, we're close. And then you get to the day when you're done with class, right? And then what happens? You get your diploma. And what's another thing that typically happens that comes from ancient times? When you get to that place, when you don't need to be a student anymore, or you graduate in some sense of the word, right? You usually go to your graduation. And during your graduation, when you're just about to be sent out, what do you get? You get what's called a commencement speech, right? Now, none of that's in your notes. I'm sharing all this with you just to say, like, look, that's what Jesus is doing here. He's switching from disciple to apostle because he's fixing to send them out. They're graduating. They've spent the last several chapters of Matthew being his students, observing him, studying, what he has to share with them, watching him as he does all those miracles. And guess what he's doing right here in verse 1 of Matthew 10? He's giving them the same authority, isn't he? Giving them the same authority. And we're going to see a little bit later on in the text, he gives them some very interesting things that as much as preachers and teachers like to apply pieces of Matthew 10 to the church, he's going to give these 12 some powers that, raise the dead. I'm not seeing much of that going on today. So, but again, this is for a very specific purpose. All right, so once we know he's come to this place in his ministry where he's telling his disciples, all right, it's time. You've watched me enough. You've heard me enough. I want you to go out. I want you to do ministry. I want you to do those things. Before we move on, I want you to notice one thing that we see here in these first verses. And this is another reason why I would say we are not free to say, oh, this is all about the church. This is all immediately applicable to the church. Take a look at verse 4. When he gives the list of the 12 that he gave power over unclean spirits to cast them out and heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease, and he's just about to send them out to preach about the kingdom, who does he include? Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Now, if that's about a church thing, or if that's about the new covenant, or about the Holy Spirit indwelling believers like is true in the church, that's a problem. Because I think you would agree with me, Judas Iscariot was never a believer. He never came to faith in Christ. That did not happen. And I had somebody argue me, said, well, what about when he regretted what he did? And, I said, well, that's a whole nother situation. That's not what we're talking about right here. And, at the same time, I'm going, I don't know. I can't speak about his heart at that particular moment. But I do know when Jesus is addressing him here, he's an unbeliever, right? He's a disciple. What else can we say about him? He's part of Israel. And what do we know about national Israel? National Israel contains or consists of both believing Jews and unbelieving Jews. They're still part of national Israel. And if this message is a message for national Israel, and Judas Iscariot is part of national Israel, then he can be part of the team and still not be a believing Jew. He can be given all the stuff that Jesus wants to give him as a part of Israel and still be an unbelieving Jew. Does that make sense, everybody? I know that's, but what we're doing is we're saying there's a difference between Israel and the church. And this is about the Jews, these group of Jewish guys going and speaking to Israel. All right. So in that context, Jesus is absolutely free to include an unbelieving Jew and send him out as part of the team, knowing that he's an unbeliever, knowing it. Okay. All right. So let's move forward from there. I want to take a quick look at the commands that are given in Matthew 10. And again, go back to our imagery. Think about your commencement speech. What happens most often when you graduate? You're there. A lot of the high schools have the cap and gown, and the guy gets up to give the speech. And a lot of the time, what he's doing is he's saying, "You students, you should think like this. You should be aware of this. You should do this." Right? Very, very common in a commencement speech. Why? Because he's there to say your new life is commencing. It's the beginning of your new journey, your new adventure. That's what Jesus is doing. Same thing. Same thing. So whether there is cross application or things that we can do, that's another issue. And you want to think about application, because there are places where we definitely kind of go, yeah, I could draw some spiritual applications from this information. But what I would tell you is this fits perfectly with Jesus' goal here of giving them their commencement speech and sending them on their way as a group of Jewish disciples who are going to preach to Israel and talk about the kingdom. Take a look. Look at some of the commands. And again, all I did was I bolded, you can look here on the screen. All I did was I bolded the commands. And look at that. Do not go into the way of the Gentiles. Okay, church members, how much of that, what do we, at the beginning of his commencement speech, first thing he says, don't go to the Gentiles. Well, what are you guys and me? We're Gentiles. Okay? And that's how Jesus starts his speech. Don't go to the Gentiles. Don't enter a city of the Samaritans. So don't do those two things. Only do one thing. Go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, if you're putting that together as a part of the speech, and that's how he starts the speech, shouldn't we be careful to put the speech together as a whole and recognize that he started it by saying, this is a message that is meant for you to take to Israel? Isn't that what we ought to do? Yeah. Yeah, it's not what pastors and teachers do. Well, that's how he starts the speech. All right. Look at verse 7. The next piece of this. As you go, preach. Here's the next command. Preach. What are they supposed to preach? The same message that John the Baptist preached. The same message that Jesus has been preaching. Kingdom is coming. I'm here to be your Messiah. Jesus is here to be your Messiah. Will you receive him as your Messiah? And if you are willing, you need to repent and prepare the way of the Lord. Go back to the Mosaic covenant. Get in line with what you know from the Mosaic law, because you're Israel and you're supposed to be keeping your covenant with your God, Israel. Right? And you need to do that. You need to prepare the way of the Lord if he's to bring his kingdom, if he's to come and set up the kingdom here on earth and be your king. Well, of course, we know they didn't. But here, Jesus says, you guys go preach the same message. Go preach the same message. And man, have I heard this passage get used all sorts of crazy ways. And of course, they take verse 7 and don't take anything around it. And especially not that it's part of a speech that's one whole, that's to the 12 Jewish guys. Very next thing he says, To the same people, he says, go preach the kingdom of heaven, like Jesus was doing. What does he say? Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out demons. Well, what was Jesus doing? The same thing. What's he telling them? Go preach what I've been preaching and go do what I've been doing. Isn't that what disciples do? Yeah. But at this point in Matthew, you've got to remember, this is before Israel rejected him. That is why Jesus starts it by saying, this is a message for Israel. Go to the house of Israel. Announce the kingdom to Israel. That's why, because it's an offer to the nation that they could either receive or reject. Now, we know the rest of the story, but the fact is, this is a legitimate offer on the part of Jesus to offer the kingdom, to say, will you let me bring the kingdom or not? Okay. And then he goes through and talks through what they're going to encounter. And of course, you know, don't take anything with you. Let other people provide that for you. You know, go into the house and then stay there as long as you're received. You get all those kinds of ideas. So I'm going to jump past that for the sake of time. But, you know, whoever won't receive you, shake off the dust from your feet. We know those. And then, of course, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Great, great truth. And that's one that I would say, there's so much practical application. Absolutely. But what I want you to see is this is part of a context where Jesus said, I'm sending you out. You're going to Israel to announce the kingdom. Here's what you're going to encounter. And not only are you going to encounter good things, you're going to encounter some bad things. They're going to deliver you up to councils. They're going to scourge in their synagogues, right? And then look at the middle of verse 19. Don't worry. He said, don't worry about how or what you should speak, right? So we know that passage. The Holy Spirit's going to give you utterance, right? Which was true not only in their situation, but with the apostles in Acts. We know that. But he says, the one who endures to the end will be saved. Does that sound like anything else you know in Matthew? Yeah. It's the exact same phrase that we see in Matthew 24. All right. We're going to come back to that, but let me just jump down and we'll talk more. So don't worry. And he says, when they persecute you in this city, flee to another. He says, don't fear. He says, whatever I tell you in the dark, speak in the light. Whatever you hear in the ear, preach on the housetops. Man, I've heard preaching on this, and I kind of go, wait a minute. Jesus is telling them he wants them to get up on the housetops and preach the kingdom to Israel. He's not spiritualizing that at all. He's not saying be vocal about it or just do it in public. He's saying get up on the rooftops and announce the kingdom. Literally. You know, where would they have done that from? Rooftops. Okay? You don't have to spiritualize it. If all you do is see it as part of a sermon or a speech and recognize that Jesus' goal here is to give them their mission as his disciples who have become his apostles, and he's sending them out to give this message to Israel, then you can look at a verse like that and go, hey, Jesus is telling them, like, the stuff I've been telling you, get up on the rooftop and proclaim it. Right? So do not fear. Fear him who's able to destroy both soul and body. And don't fear. You're more value than many sparrows. So you got all those commands in there that line up with what we see, you know, in our time as a commencement speech given to a specific group of people who are being sent out on their next stage in life. Okay? So the next part of my notes that you got for today, what I focused on was the fact that Jesus all the way through Matthew 10 is saying, say stuff, say stuff, say stuff. You know, preach it, speak. So I'll let you take a look at that. Please walk through that in your notes, and hopefully it'll make some sense for you. But again, if Jesus' goal is to say what I've been saying, preach what I've been preaching, do what I've been doing, do it to Israel, because you're talking about the kingdom that I want to bring here to earth. If that's what it is, it's all one speech. It's all together, and it's for them. So, you know, and at the end of Matthew 10, there's this promise of reward. And I'll let you walk through that with the notes too, because I'm going to have to jump over to another piece here to talk forward, you know, what I want you to hear with regard to Matthew 10. But what you do see here at the end of Matthew 10, and I'll explain in the, you know, you can read it in the notes, my explanation. There are several passages in here, and I know you guys have heard a lot of preaching on almost every part of you know, especially Matthew 32 through 39. You know, he who finds his life will lose it. He who loses his life for my sake will find it. You know, and again, it's another place where we tend to spiritualize. But if you think about what Jesus is saying to them and the conflict and persecution that they're going to encounter, and he's just told them a little bit earlier, it's like they're going to deliver you up, scourge you, and kill you. But if you endure the end, then you'll be physically saved, right? Then what does he say here? Similar idea. It's like if you find your life, if you hang on to your life, you lose it. Whatever that is, you lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake, we say, lose your life. Oh, that just means surrender. No, it doesn't. It means you lose your life. It means you get killed. What is he telling him is going to happen to them? He's telling them that a lot of they're going to get killed. What's happened to you know, what happened to a lot of them in the early church? They got killed. You know, but what he says is, if you lose your life for my sake, you're gonna keep it. Whatever that cost you, you're gonna hang on to that. That's going to be a reward that you're not going to lose. But my point is, you know, this whole idea of losing your life, and we spiritualize it to mean something else. It's like, in the context, no, he's talking about, all right? So, you know, application is maybe something else, but meaning, there's no great reason to spiritualize almost any part of this sermon. All right, let me encourage you not to, as you consider Matthew 10. All right, so that being shared, let me jump out for just a second, because what I want to suggest to you is what you see in Matthew 10 with Jesus saying, okay, you disciples, you're now apostles. I'm sending you out. You're going to go preach the kingdom because I'm your Messiah. I'm here to offer it and to bring it and to set up my throne and reign all the nations from Israel, because Israel will be the center of the world. Him saying that and saying a lot of the other things that he says, the language is so close to Matthew 24. So close. There's so much overlap. And those of you who know Matthew 24 know that Matthew 24 is about the tribulation. What's the tribulation? It's the time of God's dealing with Israel in order to prepare them, prepare the way of the Lord, for the kingdom that when Christ comes again, the second coming, he will wipe out all his enemies, set up his kingdom, and reign. But the tribulation in particular is that time when God is preparing Israel for that. Okay? So if you think about it, and you know what Matthew 24 says about the nature of the tribulation and the things that are going to happen in the tribulation, what I did was I developed a table that compares Matthew 10 with Matthew 24. And here's what I'd like to tell you, because remember, we're talking about Matthew, all about Matthew 1 through 25 is all about Jesus as the Son of David coming to offer himself as Messiah and to offer his kingdom here on earth. All right? When we get to Matthew 24, there's no question about that. If you take the Bible literally, you read Matthew 24 and you go, well, he's talking about getting ready for the kingdom to come here on earth. and, which tribulation and getting ready for what we call the millennial kingdom. We all go, oh yeah, of course. Well, let's take a look at the overlap between Matthew 10 and Matthew 24. And I invite you to just take a look at each piece of this because it's so helpful, especially if you're thinking about Matthew 24 and you go, I'm going to preach on Matthew 10. Well, be careful, because we don't preach Matthew 24 and go, well, that's us. Because if we believe in a literal tribulation, most of us believe we're going to be gone. We're going to be raptured because we're the bride and we're going to go with our groom to our honeymoon. We won't be here. So, to do that with Matthew 24, and then say, well, wait a minute, but Matthew 10 I can play with completely differently. I could be a teacher or professor or a pastor and handle it completely differently. No, it's a different context, but the offer is still the same. The purpose is still the same. All right. So let's take a look. Again, what I would argue is that Matthew 10 was what was prior to Israel's rejection, but it was the initial offer or the first offer of the kingdom. Okay, and as the first offer in the kingdom, it was John the Baptist and Jesus coming and saying, all right, will you receive it? Are you ready for it? Will you prepare the way of the Lord? Are you ready to receive me and to have it, to be ready for me to come, wipe out your enemies and reign? All right, that's Matthew 10. Matthew 24 is, you notice in Matthew, after Matthew 10, and specifically after Matthew 11 and 12, which we're about to get to. Matthew 24, of course, is Jesus already walked through and said, look, and in the end, here's what's going to happen. And he talks about it like, I'm not going to be here for that. I won't be here for that piece. So here's what you're going to encounter in the tribulation, right? And it's clear to everybody that that's the tribulation. Well, what is that? That's the final kingdom offer. It's what the Old Testament refers to as Daniel's 70th week, right? The time of Jacob's trouble. So what is that? That's a 7-year period where God is dealing again with Israel. The church is gone, so it's the next time that God will deal with Israel. Just like in Matthew 10, who's he dealing with? Israel. Matthew 10 is about Israel. Matthew 24 in the tribulation is about Israel. Okay? No reason to make a distinction there. So the difference is, again, after Christ's rejection, that remains future. Daniel's 70th week to get ready for the kingdom, that's still out there. That becomes out there in the future somewhere. So the kingdom has to be offered the final time out there somewhere. And that's what we're going to see in Matthew 24. Okay, so let's look at some of the relationships, the scope. Matthew 10, only Israel. Go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Notice how it shifts in Matthew 24. This gospel of the kingdom, okay, gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world. By whom, it doesn't say, right? We know if we read Revelation that includes at least the 144,000. But he says, will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations. And the other word for nations is Gentiles. Gentiles. Okay? So again, if the focus of both Matthew 10 and 24 is on Israel and the kingdom, it makes perfect sense. Matthew 24 makes the same sense as Matthew 10. Gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to the Gentiles. The kingdom is coming. The Messiah is going to come. He's going to wipe out every unbeliever. He's going to set up his kingdom. And guess what happens at the end of the tribulation? Exactly that. All right. You'll notice in the document that I put the Old Testament passages that are related to this, to the idea there in parentheses. So just for your own notes. But look, the focus of the message, the coming kingdom. Matthew 10, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Matthew 24, gospel of the kingdom is going to preach and then be preached, right, to everybody. And then, of course, Jesus goes on to say, and then the end comes, right? So what's the commission, to Israel or to the disciples who are going to speak to Israel? As you go, preach what? Kingdom of heaven. Matthew 24 will be preached. It's going to be preached, announced. Okay. Between Matthew 10 and 24, what else do you see? Persecution from the outside, something that we know is true of what's called the time of Jacob's trouble, Daniel's 70th week. What was part of what Jesus was doing? If Israel is ready, if they will prepare the way of the Lord, the 70th week is coming. 70th week will be here. And then the kingdom will come. Because before the kingdom can come, according to the Old Testament prophecies, the 70th week has to come. And what happens during that time? Israel is persecuted. Matthew 10, they'll deliver you up to the councils and scourge you. When they persecute you in this city, flee to another. Sound familiar from Matthew 24? Look at Matthew 24. They'll deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. Verses 15 through 24, where he talks about the abomination of desolation. He says, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. For why? For them there will be great tribulation, which is exactly how he describes it in Matthew 10, if we're honest. Okay, persecution from within, right? And we talked about earlier in Matthew 10, this whole idea that Judas Iscariot could be part of it, even as an unbelieving Jew, because he was a Jew, because he was part of Israel. And what we see in both Matthew 10 and Matthew 24 is during that 70th week, or during that time of Jacob's trouble, that not only would they be persecuted from the outside, but they'd persecute each other. Look at Matthew 10. Brother will deliver up brother to death. Father his child. Children rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. Why? Because one is a believing Jew and one is an unbelieving Jew. Okay? Jesus said, I didn't come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword. I've come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And we, this is another passage. We read this and we go, yeah, it's about the church. And yeah, have we had persecution? Have we had very similar analogy to all of that? Yeah, but this is about Israel during that time. This is Jesus saying, look, if you take my offer, and if you preach to them and they take my offer, the 70th week's got to come. And in the 70th week, unbelieving Jews are going to offer each other up, and they're going to go against each other. They're going to, all of that's going to happen. It's not going to be pretty. As part of the time of purification to get you ready for the kingdom, some bad stuff is going to happen. Take a look at Matthew 24. Then many will be offended, will betray one another. Who do you betray? You betray somebody that's close to you, right? They'll hate one another. Wow. Same animal, same stuff. Okay. And again, I know for everybody hearing this, 99% chance this is very new information to you. So I would tell you at the moment, just absorb it, because once you see, look at this. Israel is the source of testimony to the Gentiles, right? Israel's Messiah came to offer salvation to all mankind, initially through Israel. But of course, Israel said no. So Jesus said, okay, we're going to do the church. And then when the church is gone, then I'll start working with you again, and then we'll see what you do. So that's what we see in Matthew 24, right? But verse 18 of Matthew 10, you'll be brought before governors and kings for my sake as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles, to the nations, to the nation. Okay? All right. Now, like I said, the language is so close, you cannot ignore it, how these two chapters overlap, because they're both offering something, and they are both about Israel. They're both about Israel, and they're both about the offer of the kingdom. Okay? Next thing, they're hated by all. And have Christians been hated? Yes, of course. Have Christians been persecuted? Yes, of course. But remember, the context of Matthew 10 is the disciples who have become apostles who were sent out to Israel to preach the kingdom. And he says, you'll be hated by all for my name's sake. Matthew 24, which we see as the tribulation, which we recognize that believing Israel will be his spokesman. What does he say there? They'll deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you'll be hated by everybody, all nations, for my name's sake. Well, if he says you'll be hated by all nations, all Gentiles, well, who's the focus on? Israel. Israel, and particularly believing Israel. Okay? Same phrase in both chapters. Look at the next place where you have the same phrase in both chapters where the idea is exactly the same, pointing to the time of Jacob's trouble. Verse 22 in Matthew 10, he who endures to the end will be saved. So when they persecute you, flee. All right, Matthew 24, he who endures to the end will be saved. Echo, echo, echo. Okay, same exact phrase, and it's 14 chapters apart. Why? Why would you have so much common language unless the goal was the same? I'm hoping that's making sense to everybody. Again, I'll keep going, but the idea is, you know, Jesus is talking about the offer of the kingdom. The focus is Israel. God's working with Israel to offer the kingdom, to offer, you know, to have the kingdom offer, where he will come and rule on the earth. And everything in chapter 10 needs to be seen in that light, I would argue. And the notes will make that more clear, but let me continue. So again, you have not only that with surviving the 70th week, but you have this whole idea of enduring until the end, trying to make it until the end of that time. So he uses the same exact phrase. And then look at verse 22 in Matthew 24, unless those days were shortened, right? Unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. So what's he talking about? Physical life. This is about the physical life that will be saved. It's the same in Matthew 10. He's talking to them as his apostles. He says, man, hang in there, make it to the end so that you don't get killed, because that's what they're going to try to do, is kill you. What do we know about the tribulation? Same thing. All right. All right. Couple more things and we're done. Next thing, there's an end to the mission. There's a fixed period of time. And we know from the Old Testament, from several places, especially from Daniel, the 70th week is a fixed period of time. It comes to an end, and at the end of that, the kingdom comes. Jesus sets up his kingdom at the end of that. Look at what he says in Matthew 10. For assuredly, I say to you, you will not have gone through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Well, how can he say that if he's not offering them the same thing that's being offered in Matthew 24? How can he even say that? I've watched people do gymnastics around that in trying to talk about that verse. But as soon as you say, wait a minute, it's the same offer of the kingdom. It's just one is before his rejection and one is after his rejection. One was rejected, the other one will happen. Because we know at the end of the tribulation, the kingdom will come and Jesus will reign and he will wipe out all his enemies and there will be peace and safety. And we will have 1,000 years on this earth of beauty and wonderful, absolutely amazing, right? Okay. So the cost and rewards for the remnant, or for the believing Jews. Whoever confesses me before men, I'll confess him before my Father who is in heaven. Again, that points to a future time where their confession or their proclamation of Jesus is rewarded. And while, again, that phrase, that verse gets abused in several different ways, I'd argue the same thing. This has something in common with what we see in Matthew 24 and 25. And I'm going to argue that's what the two parables are there for at the end of Matthew 24 and beginning of Matthew 25. But we'll get there. That part we'll get to. So don't worry about it. All right. So let me summarize it here at the very bottom end of the table. Matthew 10, the disciples or apostles, the ones who were sent out after their commencement speech, offer the kingdom to Israel so that Israel can offer it, or they'll be the light or the way of transmitting it to the Gentiles, right? After he's rejected, he talks about what it's going to look like in the future, Daniel's 70th week. Israel, the remnant, will offer the kingdom to the world, and we know that's at least through the 144,000, or the Gentiles, and so they'll be the testimony. They'll be the light to the Gentiles that they were supposed to be the first time around. But of course, they rejected. All right. So, all right, it's close to time to quit. But again, I would just argue, as you work through Matthew 10, just keep in mind, think commencement speech, think about the disciples/apostles being sent out on their next adventure with the mission to do and to say like they saw Jesus say and do. And that's not something that we can easily or quickly say, well, okay, wait a minute, that's all about the church. No, it's not. No, it's not. Not only that, he tells them only go to Israel. And then number two, they're doing things like raising the dead, healing the lepers. You know, if you can't take those and yank them out, then I wouldn't yank out any of the, I wouldn't pull the others out of context either. It's all one speech for the same group. All right. All right.